Well, friends, thanks for joining us for a first-time effort at a roundtable discussion for us here at CrossRoads. And I want to thank our panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves here in a moment. But our purpose here today is to talk about what's happening in the culture with all the protests, with the unjust killings of not just these two that have happened recently, but there's been a history of this kind of disconnect. And it is racially oriented, and we all are aware of this atmosphere of tension. And so I've asked these panelists who bring a unique expertise to our discussion today. I'm going to start with Dennis and let him introduce himself and what his background is, and then we'll move to Mike. So,
my name is Dennis DuVal. I'm a member of CrossRoads and have been for a while. My background, I've spent 28 years in law enforcement in Syracuse community. I've also been involved in numerous businesses here over a period of time. I've been in this community since I'm 18 years old, right. When I went to college here at Syracuse University. So, and I've had experiences working in this community and working with the community, and also working in the police department over the years to try to formulate the right relationships that we should be utilizing now.
Okay, thanks, Dennis.
Thank you. Thanks, Mick. So my name's Mike Maurer, and I attend CrossRoads, and been in the community since a young man, but then moved away, went to Alabama and Kentucky for graduate school, lived in San Francisco a couple times. This is about my 50th year in mental health, and 40 of them back here in Syracuse. I'm in private practice now, but over the years I've worked in a number of communities and enjoyed the fact that part of what I hope to add tonight is maybe the transitions that I've seen in my own experience, being as a field placement student at Lemoyne College in my junior, senior year, and I ended up for the first time ever working in a community of color in terms of our Syracuse community. And the exciting part for me is wanting to work with people, wanting to help people, and then getting the advantage, the real blessing of being able to become what some authors call proximate to an experience that has not been your own. And I hope that we'll talk a bit about that. So it is an honor to be today with you all to talk about the fact that, you know, I've got a mental health perspective, but also maybe a little bit of the human being perspective in relationship to some of the tremendous tragedy that we're going through as a culture, and be able to reflect on it from both a mental health standpoint as well as perhaps my own experience working in a number of communities where I was able to really have that nice, what we call intimate experience with people that you did not grow up with, but you've come to understand maybe. Yeah.
Great. Good. Great. Thanks. And I appreciate you both giving of your time at a busy time. I know, especially for you, Mike, in terms of mental health counseling, it's a really busy situation right now. So I'm going to start with you, Dennis, and ask you a question just in terms of what were your initial reactions first a couple weeks ago with the Arbery killing of the man who was jogging, and then more recently with George Floyd, and the graphic ways that these were presented, and how that struck you when those things happened?
Well, even with my experience in law enforcement, I was horrified. In both situations, especially in the Arbery situation, there's something that I believe that is possible to happen anywhere. For someone of color, that type of scenario runs through your mind, quite frequently, just when you move about in different parts of the community, maybe communities that you're not from. You know that could be a possibility, something like that could happen to you based upon what you look like as opposed to what you have actually done. We live with that, people of color live with that our entire lives. And from a cultural perspective, we're made aware of that at a very young age, to be acutely aware where you're at, and never be too comfortable, even though you might think that you should not be. With the Floyd situation, I was just horrified, and I was saddened but horrified, and it was just something that I never thought that I would ever see in the way. But with that, I think that the rest of the nation has seen what most people of color have been talking about and complaining about and had voices about for so many years. And I think if it does anything, hopefully it has made people aware, acutely aware of why people feel the way they do. why they have such distrust sometimes in a lot of circumstances.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the reaction to this is something that was almost like hanging in the air, the disconnect between people's experiences as a person like myself who's from a rural area. And can you talk a little bit to what it was like as a teenager growing up around law enforcement in New York City when you were growing up?
Well, first of all, to preface it, I have family members that were in law enforcement, but that didn't change the atmosphere for me or my cousins or my relatives. We were always aware of who was working on the shift. To this day, I can tell you the car numbers, the precinct numbers, car 311, 315, were the car numbers in my neighborhood that patrolled my neighborhood. We always looked at what time of day, who was working. We didn't know them by name, but we knew them by sight. Not that they were doing something to me personally, but to other members of my community. Some were better than others. Some were more understanding, some were more cajoling, some were more, intimate in terms of, speaking to you. And then there were others that you knew you had to keep a wide berth from. The fact of the matter that they were working in our areas, and where I lived was predominantly black. We had very few white families in my neighborhood. We had a few, but not a lot. But it was, basically a black neighborhood, and they patrolled in it. And it just, as a young person, you knew that at any point in time, whether you walk into the store for my grandmother who lived on the same street as me, and walking at home, there's a possibility that I could get stopped. And not so much for what I was doing, but maybe what someone else was doing, that might look like me, dress like me, but maybe they thinking that's me. But they're going to treat me the same way they're going to treat them. And I've always, and maybe that's one reason why, and I can tell you that's probably the main reason why I sought a career in law enforcement, because obviously I had family members that were involved in it. But, there was always discussion of how you change things. How do you bring about change? How do you as an individual bring about change no matter what it is in our culture? The best way to do it is from within. Start from within inside and try to make changes as you go through. That I think that, when I first started in law enforcement, that I was going to be the chief of police of Syracuse Police Department and the first African-American to be the chief. No, I did not. Did I have those aspirations? Absolutely I did. So much so that when I had my background being done and I had a polygraph done, the guy that was the detective doing the polygraph, he said, "Where do you perceive you would be in 5 years?" I said, "A supervisor." He laughed and he said to me, "Oh, about 10 years, 20 years from now." I said, "One day maybe I'll be the chief of police." The day I got promoted, this guy retired off the Syracuse Police Department probably 15 years before that. He called me and he sent me a letter. He said, you always had it in your mind. I guess you knew where you were going to be." I didn't really know it, but I had those. Had the same aspirations as any young person trying to move. But I guess maybe that's why I wanted to be involved, seeing the things that took place in my neighborhood, maybe wanting to make a change, maybe wanting to do things differently, and maybe making people see me as they should really be seeing me.
And so that tension, one of the ways of helping with that tension for you was to try to be an insider who kind of understood where people were coming from and maybe communicate some of that to those who are in law enforcement. That's awesome. Mike, you're a counselor, you're a longtime student of human behavior. Tell us, how people get to where they are in this disconnect, and then ways that you think we can try to do some bonding across those divides.
So let me answer the first part and then you might have to remind me about the second part.
Yeah, okay.
But I think growing up in a family, Dennis and you were talking earlier before the program, his dad was a combat vet. My dad was also a combat vet. And so in the Battle of the Bulge, he suffered what was called trench foot in those days. And so you would just stay in your boots. You would never took them off. You took them off, you'd never get them back on again. So his feet were rotting. So after the battle, which was horrific, 80,000 losses on our side, he was shipped to London to have his feet cut off.
Wow.
Yeah. So I loved when he would tell the story.
Yeah.
Because he would say, there was this army nurse, this black woman, who said, "You're not losing those feet.
Wow.
And he told us the story when we were this big. He said, every night she'd rub my feet with oil. She'd massage me. She said, I'm going to save those feet. And she did.
Wow.
He never did get his feet cut
Wow.
off. As a matter of fact, that's the military. You know,
Yeah.
Right.
you do what you got to do. And then
Yeah.
as soon as he got himself better, then they put him in Paris and he became an MP. Because it's war. War wasn't over.
Yeah, it's still going on.
So my dad had that sense of equality probably from his earliest need
Yeah.
to understand that we're all people.
Yeah.
And he became a union president right down the road in Fayetteville, Precision Castings. He was there for decades. And he was always somebody that would talk about fairness and justice and
Yeah.
a sense of understanding human beings for the human beings that they are. My mom was very much the same way. Mom always came from a spiritual place. Dad was quiet about his faith, very quiet. Didn't know much about it, but Mom was always saying what the Lord was doing and, you know, all of the
Yeah.
spiritual parts. So she was always big on, you know, kind of a understanding that the biblical narrative is not a narrative. It's not a story. It's a reality that we need to love each other and we need
Yeah.
to love people. So
Yeah.
I guess from the earliest stage, those two principles that I saw firsthand were modeling and imitation. So we think in psychology that we model after the people that are close to us and we imitate them.
Yeah.
I watched my little guy one year, and he was about this big. He's 38 years old now, and he kept going like this. And he was just a little 2 or 3 year old, and he kept going like maybe 4-year-old. And what the heck is he doing? Of course, I was sitting like this, and he was emulating the fact that I was sitting like, he's going to be like Papa. Right?
Yeah.
So we model and we imitate, and then we become part of a sense of attachment and belonging to the people that we're with. And it's an important part, especially in adolescence, that we don't know better than to be with the people we're with. So I think one of the opportunities is to remember how we are role modeling to our children in our words, in our actions, and in our beliefs, and in our heart, how we think about other human beings.
Yeah. So it's intergenerational influence.
Absolutely. Tons of intergenerational influence, absolutely.
And we absorb those ideas without even knowing that we're absorbing them. And sometimes they're not healthy.
Right.
But they are what they are.
They are what they are.
And so the experience of being in a neighborhood where you're wondering which cop is in the patrol car, and the experience of having your dad tell you how a black woman, you know, helped him be able to have his mobility later in life. And those things can create an environment that's conducive to some sort of dialogue and understanding of each other's situation, even though you both have this very divergent experience of where you're coming from, and mine is, you know, out here in the rural community. How would you say it can be processed? In other words, how can a person not just be a slave or captive to their personal worldview about other people? How can they, in the physiological, chemical realm, can people change, I guess? And if so, how?
I read this in an educator's journal decades ago, that ignorant really means ignoring a truth. You know, you're ignorant to a truth. So Brian Stevenson, in much of his work as an attorney, and he's written the book, and it's called Just Mercy, the book in the movie, he talks about being proximate, literally getting inside the experience of another human being. And I think that's probably one of the most difficult parts of our culture today, is that we're so separate and distinct in our own sense, again, of belonging to where we belong. We took the porches off the front of the house and we put decks in the back of houses, you know, so we don't walk home from the streetcar and say hello to each other. We don't have that same element of really working side by side. So the proximate is huge. When I worked in construction in my summers in college and high school, I worked in a construction company side by side with many black men, and they were just so wonderful to me. And saved my life on occasion, and that's true, because it's dangerous work. You're in a pit, there's holes with big machinery and pipes and backhoes. And I remembered them like a brother, you know, in a sense of just, I went to one man's funeral when he died of a heart attack, Cleveland Sanders. It was a wonderful, wonderful man. And I felt there in that sense of his church, I felt a sense of a bond because I cared about him. I think we forget proximate. We don't understand that if we don't get next to someone, we don't know their experience. So we talk about it theoretically, but to break the theory is to get into activity. We've got to get more involved. So whether it's through work in a food kitchen or a volunteer, in terms of a committee in a school, or you want to be part of the youngster that wants to be part of the experience of the other children that is not his experience or her experience. It's like almost making a commitment. If your family didn't do it, you can do it. There's a way to get out of the mold, so to speak.
So what I hear you saying is it's got to be intentional.
Intentional.
And it's got to be relational.
And relational,
and not,
absolutely.
And it can't be just, you know, going through some sort of program that's kind of a token thing. It needs to be a longer term relationship that you intentionally build to try to see across this chasm.
And people see through that.
Yeah.
Yes.
People that you're trying to communicate see through your intentions, whether or not they're long term.
If it's real or just
if it's real
token.
Or not. And a lot, as you said, a lot has to do with seeing, living experience, but listening. You know, sometimes when people, you know, the big frustration is that people have been saying these things for a long time.
Yes.
They've been saying them, and people saying, well, you know, it doesn't happen to me, so. You know, it's probably not gonna happen to you, or it didn't happen to you, or can't happen to you, and that's just not reality. You know, and that's what frustrates a lot of people of color. You know, they're saying, "Hey, these things are happening. Nobody's listening. No one wants to believe us."
Right.
You know what I mean? Now that they see it, and I think the best thing that will come out of this is that people have actually lived that experience by watching that video, and they're saying, you know what? They've been telling us this.
Yes.
They've been telling us these things happen.
Right.
Now we saw that it happened. There's no denying it now.
Yeah, Ferguson was reported, but there wasn't any video.
Yeah. For every incident has its own flavor to it. Every incident has its own system of what's true, what's not true, you know. But when you're seeing it and looking at it in living color, and you're watching another human being die that shouldn't die right in front of you, there's no turning back that experience. You know, once you view death in that manner, there's no turning back. You can't say I didn't see it.
Yeah.
You can't say I didn't see it.
Which leaves you to either say, this is truly unjust.
Right.
And I'm enraged by this, you know, and feel the need that something must be done.
Right.
Or you entrench and rationalize away that as a reality and try to say, well, that's, you know, this is just an isolated incident. It's not really a problem. It's just an isolated incident. Now, as a chief of police, as someone who drove in a patrol car yourself, how would you speak to someone who wants to say this is the exception to the rule? There's no, there's no reason to be upset by this. There's
a reason to be upset. It's just that simple. If you're not upset, then there's something wrong with you. And that's just my personal feeling. I served in law enforcement 28 years. I've never seen anything like that. There's no policy, there's no procedure, there's nothing that would say that this was something that was done right. There's no room for it. There's no room for it. It's so blatantly wrong, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. You have to first have the acceptance that, Mick and Mike, that there's racism in every form of where we exist. If you don't accept that, if you think that it's just over here, it's just in the police department, then you're missing the message. It's everywhere we sit. Sometimes maybe less than others, maybe not as blatant, maybe not as overt, but it still exists. It still exists. So if you're under the premise that, well, that's not really racism, racism doesn't exist here, it exists in churches, it exists in business, it exists everywhere. And the fact of the matter is that we're bringing it to light because of this circumstance. That is where we start. The acceptance that it does exist. Maybe it doesn't exist in your world, but it does exist in the world that we all live in. You know, so you first have to have that premise that it does exist. Some people didn't even want to acknowledge that. You know, and that's where this premise of, well, I can't see why that could happen. Well, it could happen because it has happened. It's real. You know, so you have to first, and the frustrating part is that when you tell people about your experiences, or you tell people, well, this is what happened to me, or, these things are happening, and people saying, well, that's an isolated incident. One time is enough. Once is enough of anything. In my book. Because that's one is the time that we caught it. How about the many times that we haven't caught it?
What had happened before?
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So.
Thank you. This makes me ask the question of you, Mike. What, in terms of a person dealing with what they've seen and the outrage that they feel and the injustice that they feel, and let's say there's two different kinds of persons with that. Those who can identify directly with it, who've experienced, an unjust treatment situation maybe from law enforcement, that someone was, treating them a certain way just because they were black and in a white neighborhood or something like that. So there's those who can directly identify with it, and then there's those who maybe not come from that background, but this has kind of opened up their awareness of it. What kind of internal processing would you encourage people to have in both of those situations? How to cope with the level of emotional power that's going on inside them, so to speak?
I think some people, it's so abhorrent to the human spirit to watch someone killed right before our eyes, right, with a sense of a dual reality of you're there to protect us and you're harming this man to the point that he dies right before our eyes.
Yeah.
And there's no part of that that isn't abhorrent to us, right? And yet some people will probably say it's just too much, and it might even be for them a little bit too difficult to let in. And so to sensitize the reality of those that can't see it, I think the reality is, as Dennis said and you've said, is to keep this in front of us, because things go away pretty quickly. We tend to move on as a culture, and make a commitment as a family to read, view some movies that really do capture what the experience of other people experience. And that's the hardest part. Empathy begins with, as my first supervisor, one of my supervisors in 1970, Laura Colas, said to me, Mike, my best definition of empathy is putting yourself in your client's field of perception. We could translate that to a person's field of perception, colleagues' field of perception who lost their job, neighbor's field of perception whose mother died. We struggle with trying to get inside somebody else's field of perception. Right. Perception is interesting. It's what we see, but it's also what we experience, because to get inside their experience, we can't just see it and say, oh, I'm so sad for you, Mrs. Smith, that you got to carry those groceries up the stairs and you're elderly and it's a cold winter night and the bag could slip and could fall and it's your last $20. It must be very difficult. Well, there's some empathy there. Maybe there's even a tad of sympathy there. But the action would be, let me carry those groceries for you up the stairs. Ma'am, please, please, please let me. Oh, no, I'm fine. No, please. I don't want you to slip. So we would get involved, and I think we have to bring that action into the experience of our sympathy and our compassion. Compassion is wonderful. It's suffering with somebody. But on the other hand, but where's our action? And I think that's the hardest part today, because to take action, it's to right the wrongs and stand up for the reality that if we're not doing that as a family or a community or a business or a church, there's been some leadership statements by the CEO of Best Buy, CEO of Ford. There's some nice articles. Now, let's hope that they implement the reality of the actions they're going to take, but there's some great statements saying, as executives of these organizations, we need to take action. So every school district, every team, every church, every needs to actually get intimate to the experience of that change that's required. Yeah.
As people are identified with and dealing with this, and obviously there's been this portion of the reaction that has been violent to the point of creating another problem, you know, in terms of taking life of law enforcement people and the looting and those kind of things. To what degree do you see the isolation of the COVID virus? I mean, for 3 months prior to these events, is that involved in it? And how do we help people restrain themselves from going, you know, from the pendulum swinging from one injustice all the way over to another injustice? How do we help?
You know, we have metrics, right, and rubrics. My grandfather used to say he was a contractor right before the Great Depression, and then that hit, he had to go out on his own and tried to keep the men working, but the company was obviously struggling financially, and he would say, measure twice, cut once. And every time I cut a board too short, like I cut some curtain rods for my wife, and as I walked up the stairs, I said, oh, maybe even a cuss word, man. And at 58 inches, I realized I reversed the number. It was really 85, and I never measured twice. I cut once, right? Yeah. We have a rubric in mental health. It's isolation breeds paranoia, you know, and so the more isolated we get, the more paranoid we get. Proximity breaks isolation, and it brings us closer to know. And I think one of the things that's happening right now is we're watching the world from our TVs. We're watching the world from our Facebook and other kinds of social media that really gets us actually in an odd way more distant than close. And so I think the isolation breeds fear. And when we fear, we have an amygdala response, as you and I talked earlier, and it's fight, flight, and freeze. And that sends up this biochemical message of aversion, distance, and or attack, perhaps, or freeze, and we just freeze in time, defend, And so consequently, when that fires, you know, God in his infinite wisdom gave us that fight, flight, freeze, and when that amygdala turns on, it sends out a message through cortisol and corticotropin-releasing hormone, no pop quiz, but the reality is, when that stuff turns on, it's the most powerful force a human being can feel. It keeps us in the inner brain and takes us out of our prefrontal cortex where, as you mentioned earlier, the reasoning and the judgment and the planning and the decision-making. So we become very reactive, potentially very aggressive, or maybe, in fact, immobilized. And so the sad part about the immobilization is now we want a culture not to immobilize, and we certainly don't want a culture on attack right now, because the reality is we've got to be conversant with each other and talk. And yet it's hard when we're in that we call it the primitive brain. It's very, very immediate. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And we've all seen it. We know the child that throws the desk because he's been so humiliated in the classroom situation. And he also, maybe dad's in the hospital, maybe mom is struggling in her own ways, and he throws the desk, and we see the amygdala response right before us, and then we blame him because we get aggressive with someone's aggression, or we don't sit there and say, buddy, come out in the hallway and talk with me. You know, we don't create community with him. Community can be the two. Let's go out in the hallway and talk, buddy. You know, let's see what's going on. So to your point,
I see COVID and this as both of health issues. That's how I view it. And I think that, you know, a lot of the people that, if you look at the numbers and the percentage of people that suffered related to the COVID, especially, there's definitely a demographic of people of color that have been affected by
lost
this.
Their jobs.
Lost their job, but also lost their lives in terms of the percentage of people that have died, especially in New York State. And you take that frustration with that and you bring it with this, and couple it with this is definitely a health issue. You know, people are dying that shouldn't be dying, and they're dying and over a period of time. This thing is keep going on and going on. So I think the two kind of coincide with each other as health issues, and I think that they have to be addressed with a lot of communication, a lot of dialogue, a lot of people. I mean, change comes with a risk. And if you're not afraid, if you're afraid of the risk of the change, you won't make change. You know, it doesn't have to be comfortable all the time. Sometimes uncomfortable things make you better in the end. You know, so you have to be prepared for that. You know, and sometimes those conversations that we need to have are not real comfortable in the beginning. They just aren't. And you know, some of the best changes that I've made in my life is when I was put in an uncomfortable position. And you know what? I'm better for it to this day. I know I'm better for it to this day. And the outcomes have always been better. But now we're at a point in our society, especially in America, we have to be who we say we are. We have to show the rest of the world that, you know, we make other people think that they're supposed to do this in other countries. We need to do it in our own country. We need to stop figuring out ways to stop saying, okay, it's good for you and not good for us. You know, sometimes we take more effort in not addressing the problem, which automatically comes back again. So it might not be comfortable to have these conversations sometimes. It might not be comfortable to reach out to someone that's different than you. It might be uncomfortable to say, you know, I want to get involved, and I want to get involved in the right way. I don't know how. It might be uncomfortable to admit that you don't know what to do. But that's okay. That's okay. There's people that help you. There's people that, I mean, there's a lot of gracious people around that want you involved. You know, if you look at the mass of people that are out there protesting, they all don't look alike. They all don't look alike. And that's the message. They all don't look alike. They all want change.
And if I could just piggyback on Dennis's comments about the COVID and the isolation and the death and the sense of despair, powerlessness, hopelessness, despair, oftentimes fires us up to be incredibly aggressive at times, because it's just the throwing of the desk is the boy's powerlessness, his despair. You don't get me, there's no way out of this. So whether it's the person that's lost their position or their job, or the person that's lost a lot of family members through COVID, and or what's going on in relationship to perhaps a perception of the country's falling apart, that creates a particular hopelessness and despair feeling that sets our amygdala.
Well, and I was going to say, it seems to me, and you guys feel free to tell me I'm wrong, but it seems to me there's a lot of purposelessness right now. When the economy stops, then not just the income, but my purpose for living is partly my job, what I do. The purposelessness that I think was there even before COVID, where politically there seemed to be an absence of purpose. It seemed like, and again, I don't like to get political, but I think it's part of this whole thing and what's been going on. And and we can't deny that politics is extremely polarized and has been for a long period of time. And it seems like you're having to choose between one side of the politics purposes and the other side of the politics purposes. And what people do is kind of line up, and then they lob mortars at each other across this chasm. And it's not necessarily racial, but racial plays into it. And to me, I think this purposelessness is part of what the church can bring to this dialogue and to the outcome of this. I look back to the history of the church. I mean, it was a nothing entity in its infancy, and it became irresistibly effective and powerful because it broke down the barriers between Jew and Gentile, between Christian and pagan, between man and woman, between slave and free, between races and country alliances. Christianity became the only thing that crossed all those boundaries. And that's why it was so irresistible in its infancy. But somewhere along the line, I feel like the church has gotten insular in its purposes. You know, and you look through the history, and it seems like maybe God is waking us up to the fact that Jesus gave us the great command. Love one another as I have loved you. By this all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. And it seems to me that this is an opportunity for us as the body of Christ to figure out a purpose in the midst of this. How can we be the ambassadors for Jesus? So if you'll give me that premise, do you have ideas on how we can?
Well, the church has been a big part of those that right now that have despair. It has been the cornerstone of people of color since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
It is what is called. It is what has created hope for them when there was no hope, and it will create hope and answers for the future as well. Yeah. That's just my personal belief. I think there's a lot that comes out of being spiritually connected, being a Christian, and being able to say that these are the things that God intended us to be like Jesus, to be able to forgive. But also, it also gives us the knowledge base that, you know, there is something better for all of us. We are all the same. Yeah. It's the basis for, you know, knowing that I'm just as important as you. You're just as important as me. We're all God's creatures. And we're all created by God. You know what I mean? And although some might not think that, and some might not want to think that, and some might live by another premise, it doesn't mean that we have to live by that premise. Yeah. And I think there are more people thinking the way we think, and those are the people that are going to make the changes. Yeah. You're always going to have a section, a group of people that, you know, don't believe in God. You know, and
even as followers of Jesus, we're sinners.
So we're not perfect.
There's going to be you know, wrong things that will happen and wrong strategies that are applied.
Right.
Yeah, and if I know in your discord with my thought, my value, my belief in Christ and what we might do, if I know there's a discord with me, and I know you also might be projecting from your fear, your inadequacy, your powerlessness, your vulnerability, and we use that word in psychology, right, that a projection is probably the first thing we experience, because we're all projecting. We're all looking at an experience, and we see McDonald's, we assume it's a McDonald's. We start, that's just the way the brain is built, and it can do it in literally milliseconds, thousandths of a second. So we cast an idea of who this person is or what this organization is or what this means, and whether it's the peaceful, passionate protester or someone looting, we immediately project onto that and we form a bias rapidly, and it actually creates more potential discord because the person sitting next to us goes in a different direction, and now we're arguing rather than, hey, let's just talk deeper. Let's just go a notch or two deeper. Let's try to feel like, what are these people feeling? What's been going on here? What are you feeling right now? Yeah. I don't think we realize how defensive we can become as a culture and as a family, or maybe even, we mentioned earlier that Ulysses S. Grant married a woman whose father was a slave owner, and his father was an abolitionist, and he had to deal with his true belief. He loved the woman. He would go home for breaks with her brother from West Point, and lo and behold, he falls in love with her. Now what is he going to do? His mother and father didn't come to his wedding. it's understandable in some level, and another level, this is my boy, and they're not going to his wedding.
Yeah.
This is his choice. This is what. So to break down those projections, and he was a staunch abolitionist. He was a wonderful man in the sense of his commitment to the country. He wanted us to stay a union. He saw, as an abolitionist, a Reconstruction president, the power of his vision and his mission statement he never lost track of, right?
Yeah.
So I think that sometimes the family has to say, what is our mission statement? What's our value?
Yeah.
Because we're going to project. We're going to be inadequate. We're going to make mistakes. But on the other hand, somebody got to bring us back to north. And I love this, you know, our sins are from east and west, but maybe Mick, you probably know, but maybe somebody says in Scripture, but there's a north. In other words, I don't know if anyone said, but there's a north, and our compass has got to come back to north.
Yeah. As people's compass aligns with God's compass, I
There
think
you go.
Right.
There's north.
that's how north
I
comes
like
about.
that.
And Jesus' command to love one another, to pray for those who persecute you, to be the one who takes reconciliation seriously, and that's where I think the hope is. The Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 2 that Jesus is the one who broke down the barrier between, you know, the Jew and the Gentile, and through him living in us, I think that can happen. But it's more than just a platitude. It has to have some feet and some sweat to it, and some intentionality, as we talked about before. So I think we're kind of winding down, but I just want to ask you guys if you have any last things that you want to get across that we haven't talked about so far.
For me, it's more of don't be afraid to talk or be around those that don't look like you.
Yeah.
You know, they want the same things you want.
Yeah.
They want the same things that you want for your kids, they want for theirs.
Yeah.
You know, we're all different, but we're only made by one creator.
Yeah.
And keep that in mind. And be tolerant of others.
Yeah.
Be tolerant of others, and understand that, you know, everything is not going to get better overnight.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to have some patience.
Yeah.
You have to have some patience.
I like that, the
Thanks,
patience.
Dennis.
And it's
Yeah,
not
that's
overnight. I think that when that patience occurred for me, when I worked at Gifford Street, Huntington Family Center, as a 20-year-old, and I saw the boys in their lives, and they were my group. They were my kids. You know, we went to every activity under the sun. You know, we had 12 kids in my group. I started out with 1 or 2, and then 3. And my wonderful director, Jim Keach, was former director of the Ottawa Youth Bureau. He had such a love for kids that were disenfranchised. That Jim, and he died a year past. And I said to his wife at his wake, I said, why did he always have this love for the children that were disenfranchised? And she said, he just did. You know, that's who he was. He's just a good man. And he taught me about love in the sense of you got to get in there with them. We went to the Yoko Ono show, 12 kids to see when she came and displayed at the Verson Museum. I could take the kids to the Chiefs game because I just loved them. What I found is that the more I was involved with them, that was the beginnings in 1970. Then I ran, you know, community center in San Francisco. I was a therapist at one point for the Oakland Parole Office, and so I ran my own homes for boys in San Francisco. And what I found is the more you get involved and that proximity occurs, you just get a love in your heart because you realize the humanity of all of us is a Jesus-ordained thing, and the Holy Spirit kind of comes in, slides around on top of that. And all of a sudden, you feel your heart just kind of like, what the heck? This is just a beautiful, and it's more than just our humanity at that point. There's this beautiful grace thing that occurs that you can see the person very differently than you would ever thought, and you didn't even know that the separation occurred any longer because it was kind of like you're in there. I call it you're in there. You're just in there with the child because you care so deeply.
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate so much your time. My conclusion, folks, as you process this on your own, both what's been happening and as you process what we've talked about today, is I think about the fact of taking initiative, being proactive. I think about the idea of being patient, recognizing that we're all different and different ways that we come about these things. And then believing that we can be different. I mean, your friend that had that tremendous heart for kids, he affected you, and your heart grew larger for kids, and it became more a part of you. So intentionally be around people who you see with hearts like that, and let God grow your heart in this process so that you can be part of this only hope really that we have, and that is that the unique divine love that was poured out in the person of Christ that can indwell in us and can help us be a person who can live not only in proximity and not necessarily by by geographic proximity, but by relational proximity, and break down the fears and some of these barriers that we have. So thank you for joining us, and thank you guys for adding so much to what we're all trying to process right now, and we appreciate it very much. God bless. Have a good day.